remembering the man, the myth, the legend, Wataru Kilowatt Misaka. So where did the name Kilowatt come from?
That kind of was like his nickname through, his playing style, which is like connected, focused, energetic, and fast as lightning.
Explore what it means to make history within history.
From his point of view, it didn't seem like as big a deal.
Wow. That means to break the color barrier in the sport, now it seems like a big deal.
Join us for Roots, Race, and Culture.
Funding for Roots, Race, and Culture is provided in part by the Norman C. and Barbara L. Tanner Charitable Support Trust and by donations to PBS Utah from viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello, my friends, and welcome to Roots, Race, and Culture, where we bring you into candid conversations about shared cultural experiences. I'm Dana Gerald.
And I'm Lonzo Liggins. In America, Jackie Robinson is a household name, known for breaking the color barrier in professional baseball. He had a profound influence on American society and sports. But did you know that the color barrier in basketball was broken by a Utah native? That's right. Wataru Misaka was born in Ogden, Utah in December 1923 to Japanese immigrants. He was the first non-white athlete in professional basketball when he was drafted by the New York Knicks.
Now, at the time, there were two professional leagues which merged into the NBA in 1949. So this legend of professional basketball has largely gone unrecognized until recently. Today, we're joined by two guests who worked earlier this year to bring Watt's story to Utah audiences through a stage play titled Kilowatt. So
yes.
Let's introduce them. We have first the playwright of
the
Kilowatt.
Legend, the one, the only.
Aaron Asano Swenson. Introduce yourself, my friend.
Yeah, Aaron Asano Swenson. I'm originally from Anchorage, Alaska, but I've been here in Utah for about 30 years. And I've been working as a professional actor, costume designer, doing some film and TV work, and then recently started getting into a little bit more writing. And I was approached by Jerry Rapier from Plan B to write this play for them. So.
Anchorage, Alaska. I think you might be the first person I've ever met from Anchorage, Alaska. We'll have to talk about that, but in a moment. Brian Keto, he's an actor. He is a stage legend, so to speak. Tell us about yourself.
So I'm Brian Keto, a local Utah actor. I'm a native Utahn, lived here all my life. I've been acting since college, where I studied acting. And I've been very involved with the film scene, film commercials throughout Utah. And I've done some stage here and there, a lot through Plan B, and then the show, Kilowatt, which I did.
That's awesome. So, well, welcome, and thank you for joining us on the show.
Yeah.
And, in my family, we like basketball. I'm a huge fan. And until I heard about this play, I had no idea who broke the color barrier in basketball. But there's been an enduring movement among BIPOC communities to tell our own stories. And this momentum is just crescendoing in this production. The playwright, the director, and the actor are all Japanese descent. So here's the show's director, Jerry Rapier, explaining how this play came to be.
Kilowatt focuses on the life and legacy of Wat Misaka, who led the University of Utah men's basketball team to its only two national championships in 1944 and 1947. And I was shocked as a Japanese-American man living in Utah that I had never heard his story. And I was fascinated by his standing as the first person of color to play in what is now known as the NBA. But I couldn't find a lot about him. Watt waited to talk about his life until really late in his life. And now that he has passed, the play became a search for his story. And it made me think more about pieces that are missing in our history here in Utah.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
To me, I'm always impressed by the things that happen at Plan B, and they are the ones who introduced me to this story. And so I want to know more about what Watt went through, and that growing up in Ogden, being Japanese in those time periods was very tough, I would imagine. Can you tell us a little bit about, either one of you, about what life was like for him growing up in Ogden?
Well, sure. I mean, at that point in time, even though we would have been talking about, like late 20s, early 30s, like anti-Japanese sentiment, was still, quite high, in the United States and growing. But, Wat Masaka grew up in part of Ogden. It's, they call it 2-Bit Street, 25th Street. It kind of had a reputation for being kind of a rougher part of town. But as a result, it actually kind of ended up being sort of a sanctuary, for people from marginalized communities, where they all kind of looked out for each other. And it actually was one of the few places in Ogden where they experienced a lot less, racial prejudice and felt a little safer. It was actually a surprisingly great place to grow up in a lot of ways.
Oh, that's awesome. And, do you know how basketball became a part of his life? I mean, I got to see the play earlier this year, so I know some of this story. I'm going to try not to do any spoilers on anyone, but tell us a little bit about how he became a basketball star.
Well, it started off he started playing football in junior high, and then he got recognized, but then football wasn't his thing, and then he ended up going into basketball, where he led them to the Central Junior High basketball team to a championship. Oh. And then for his first year and his second year, and then he helped lead the Wildcats to back-to-back regional titles for Weber Junior College.
The Ogden High School team?
Yeah, the Ogden High, and then he made his mark at the NCAA championship when he got to the U and the 1944 NIT.
Wow, that is cool. What I'm curious about is, just before we get into this, even, delve deeper into this, what made you decide to, how did you find out about this story?
Oh, I found out about it from Jerry.
Oh, Jerry told you about it?
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, I guess I could have the excuse that, I grew up somewhere else, but and I'm not I wasn't a huge basketball fan, but it definitely felt like the kind of story I should have known about, but I didn't find out about it until Jerry approached me with the opportunity to write this play with Plan B.
So you just delved deeper into the history of it and just kind of really found out a lot about his life story?
Yeah, I mean, I was starting from scratch. Jerry introduced me to, the basics of the story, and I mean, just the bones of it are so interesting that I was sold, immediately in that first meeting. And so then from there, it just became a process of just research for months and months, just because there was so much out there, about him, and trying to get a handle on, the scope of the story that was already out there, and then kind of what remained to be told.
Yeah, I mean, I look at this story, and I had never heard of it before. When Dana was pitching the story, I was like, I've never even heard of this. I didn't even know that was the case either. And, as an actor, Brian, I'm wondering, had you heard of the story either?
I heard bits of it within the Japanese community. I mean, and I never got to meet the guy. Like I've said before, I wanted to meet him. He was
but
so.
You got to play him.
Yeah, I really wanted to meet him so much.
Wow.
But it was really great just learning about his history and his accomplishments.
And he's only recently passed away.
In 2019, in November 2019, yeah.
Oh, okay, so that was that recent that he passed away. Yeah. And when I know as an actor, when you receive an opportunity to play a role and delve into it, were you doing a lot of research into like how he spoke? Were you trying to copy his cadences, or were you just more trying to figure out the essence of who he was?
Yeah, and I did play him in one scene, so I was kind of trying to talk like him, but kind of I had my own process of doing that too, and and my character was just struggling to get his story out to the world and just deliver this message so he's not forgotten from history, and me as an actor, I had to approach it with just with a completely open mind, and with a lot of research of the war and and a lot of sports history with the NCAA championship, which was a really big deal at the time.
Yeah.
So.
And we're talking, these championships happened in 44 and 47, and you mentioned it. There's a huge event in between, which was World War II, and we're going to get into that. But I just want to know a little bit more about the sports side of him, because that's kind of where people get introduced to this story. And the only championships for the University of Utah, where we sit right now on the campus of this school, were in basketball, at least. The only national championships were there with him. And NCAA, NIT, what did his parents think of this sport in this event, like what he was doing.
I mean, honestly, at that point in time, you know, his father passed away when he was 15.
Oh.
You know, which really kind of left the family in a kind of a difficult position. But his mother really did a phenomenal job of stepping up to the plate. His father ran a barbershop, and so she, you know, to keep the business going, got her license, you know, like learned how to cut hair, ran that business, and supported, you know, like all three sons through college. And they all played sports, and they all attended college. But yeah, so like, I mean, she was incredibly supportive. The heartbreaking thing is that she never actually got a chance to see him play. You know, as awesome as he was, you know, like during his collegiate career, yeah. She never got a chance to see him.
Too busy cutting hair, you know.
Too busy cutting hair, yeah.
I mean, Lonzo wasn't going to have any.
Yeah.
But I mean, the barbershop, you know, it was a hub for the Japanese American community because, you know, it wasn't just a barbershop. They also had like traditional Japanese baths. You know, it was a place where people from the Japanese American community could, you know, like feel a little bit of home when they were here.
Wow, in Ogden, Utah. That's amazing.
Yeah. So where did the name Kilowatt come from?
Yeah, what was
Brian, like, where does that originate from?
It was his nickname that was given to him, and that's what kind of which goes by an unlikely hero in an unexpected sport, and that kind of was like his nickname through, you know, his playing style, which is like connected, focused, energetic, and fast as lightning.
Oh, cool.
And he rarely, mainly he went by Watt. That was the shortened version of Wataru, but he never went by Wataru. He was, even though that was his given name at birth.
So he was mostly just called Watt,
Yeah.
and then he got the nickname Kilowatt from his playing style. And unfortunately, we don't have anything to show, but I have seen footage of him playing basketball back in those days. It is out there floating in the ether of the internet, and he was fast. Like, he probably could have been a track star if he really wanted to.
But he wasn't tall, though.
He wasn't tall, no.
How tall was he? How tall was he?
5'7".
Yeah.
5'7".
5'7". So, which is, well, you know, but height doesn't necessarily mean, you know, that you're going to be a good basketball player. Remember Spud Webb and, you know, Muggsy Bogues back in the day? Those
they
guys
had
were
some short players there. In fact, there's a Japanese basketball player from Japan who's playing in the NBA. His name escapes me right now, but he's gotten a short-term contract in the NBA. He's trying to, you know, become a full-time NBA player, but he played in the Olympics for Japan and stuff. And so this is kind of a legacy that was started here with Watt. So I want to transition a little bit because between 44 and 47, we have World War II. We have the
Japanese
bombing,
internment camps.
The
We
Japanese
have,
internment camps. Like what?
Topaz. Yeah, so tell us more about like what was happening
Pearl
at
Harbor.
that time, especially with Kilowatt and Japanese Americans around that moment of World War II and, you know, with these internment camps, particularly here in Utah.
Well, yeah, I mean, by that point in time, you know, so like it was in 1942, you know, that President Roosevelt signed the Executive Order 9066 that authorized, you know, the incarceration of Japanese Americans in coastal cities, you know, in sort of like strategically, you know, strategically important, strategically vulnerable places. And so, you know, as a result of that, we have Watt Misaka and his family. You know, his father, when choosing to come to the U.S., chose not to go to California, where most people were going at that point in time. Instead, he chose to go to northern Utah, which was kind of an odd choice, but in retrospect, like, you know, he thought it was going to be safer, and he was 100% right. He just didn't know how right he was, that was going to be a choice that exempted his family from incarceration. So,
And why is that? Why did it exempt them? Because in the California versus Utah.
Oh yeah, because you know, Utah was outside of what they called the exclusion zone. The exclusion zone ran basically just like right along the western coast of the United States.
Okay.
Yeah, just because that would be the most likely place for Japanese Americans who might be, you know, to militarily interfere, you know, in the conflict. So,
Wow.
yeah.
And so, I mean, was it like a good experience for them because they didn't have to go to these internment camps? I mean, did they go visit? Did they have family there? Like, what? Do you have any idea of like what their lifestyle became in the midst of all this?
I mean, it wasn't great.
No,
You know, still.
no, it wasn't great. It was, I mean, it was definitely a struggle, you know, because they were taken from their homes. But the Japanese were very, the Japanese Americans were very resourceful, you know, finding ways to, you know, grow their own food and and do other things, and get access to like ingredients to to eat and be a little more comfortable within the barracks.
Very community-minded.
Yeah,
For sure.
very.
But like, I mean, particularly, I'm interested if you know anything about what his family would have been doing. I mean, they had a barbershop, they were part of the community, they had, like you said, the Japanese American community kind of looked at their place as a hub. Was life a little bit easier once the war broke out, or harder for them, even though they weren't in the internment camps?
I mean, I would say definitely harder, just, mostly because like just anti-Japanese sentiment had started off, at a really rough place and just kept escalating, throughout the war. I mean, at a certain point, during the war, there were curfews, for Japanese Americans. They were not allowed to approach certain strategically important places in town. Like I think it said in the play that
Because Ogden had a 10 p.m. curfew for Japanese Americans.
Yeah, it might have been earlier. I'd have to look at the research.
Well, wasn't there something about a radio station or something and a movie theater?
Yeah, they were banned. They were banned from the movies because they thought Japanese saboteurs would attack the radio station or or flood the dam so they could bomb. There was just a lot of fear rolling.
So they weren't allowed to go to those places in Utah, even though they weren't in the internment camp.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of
like
fear.
The Pineview Reservoir, or just recreational places that anybody else could have gone to see movies or swim or
So there was a lot of fear and misinformation, sort of like today. Brian, Watt was drafted into the war, correct?
Yes.
Tell us more about that.
So he was drafted twice. So the first time was in 1944 by the U.S. military. He was, the Army sent him to Japan, after training him for an invasion that never happened. And then he was drafted again in 1947. That same year, Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier.
Oh, you mean drafted into the league?
Yeah.
I see what you did there.
And then near the end of 1945, he went into the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, where he was, ordered to ask questions for bombing survivors of Hiroshima.
That begs the question for me, why don't we hear more about him in media? We hear about Jackie Robinson, but why aren't we hearing more about Kilowatt, Aaron?
That's a huge question, and there are a ton of different answers. I mean, one major thing that that I had to consider as I was looking back at this, because I'm looking through like a 7-decade telescope, through the wrong end, and so there are all these ideas that I have about professional basketball and about my assumptions about history, and the more research I did, the more I realized I had to adjust my expectations, because professional basketball at that point in time was a totally different animal. It was in its infancy. Like you said, I don't know if we said it just yet, but the NBA, didn't actually become a thing until until 2 years after Watt Masaka was drafted by the Knicks. Up until that point, professional basketball had been barnstormers. Had been leagues that or teams that were sponsored by local businesses, and so, for the most part, and no one grew up thinking that they were going to be a pro ball player. No one thought that was a way you could make a living.
It was just a way to get through school or something at that point.
Yeah, I mean, it was an interesting point in history where they were, sort of just starting to figure things out, and I mean, that's definitely part of it. He only played 3 games, and he didn't really talk about it because professional basketball at that point in time didn't seem like that big a deal to the people involved. To him, it also kind of didn't seem like as big a deal. Plus a bunch of other factors, about the way that he was let go and everything. But he went on to live this incredibly rich life, afterward, and it didn't seem, from his point of view, it didn't seem like as big a deal.
Wow. I mean, to break the color barrier in the sport, yeah, like you said, now it seems like a big deal. Back then, he just didn't even think twice about it.
It's like breaking the color barrier in like cricket or something.
Right,
you know?
right. Well, and I understand.
First black ventriloquist or something.
And there are other social factors, of course, but like, you know, the fact that it happened, you know, before the NBA became a thing, you know, sort of like reduced the visibility, and then like the much more visible, you know, like integration of the NBA itself, you know, like in 1950, like really took precedence.
So do you guys know anything about how he got let go from the Knicks, the New York Knicks? Is there any information out there that you can share about like how his career came to an end after such a short
did Google some information about that, and I don't know how legit it is. I don't even know if I should say it, but it's because I don't know if they had too many point guards or so. But I don't know why they, you know, ousted him out. I mean, and then he was offered a contract with the Harlem Globetrotters, and we don't know.
The Harlem Globetrotters, come on!
Which, I mean, but he, you know, he declined that, and we don't know, you know, the details of it, if numbers or in terms were discussed at all. But, you know, they were on the road constantly, and, you know, they would play like, you know, 200 away games in like one season or multiple games in a single day. And, you know, I mean, and maybe that, I don't know how he'd feel about doing that, really. I mean, he wanted to start a family. That was, you know, and have kids.
That's interesting.
I mean, there are a couple other factors, too, that could have played into it, you know, as well. Like the way that he was hired by Ned Irish, you know, the president of the Knicks Association at that point in time, probably to sell tickets, you know, like because he'd been, you know, he played a couple of games at Madison Square Garden, right? And you've got this New York crowd that's used to like these teams pretty much all being away teams. They're going to be a lot more welcoming. And then there's an opinion out there that I read that everything was going pretty well until his third game, which was his last game, when they did a road game in Providence, and suddenly you have a basketball crowd that is nowhere near as welcoming, that was incredibly abusive, and it was a horrible experience, not just for Watt, but also for the, you know, the rest of the team. Wow. And that it's possible that, you know, Ned Irish realized he'd made a miscalculation, you know, because when you think about like the process of Jackie Robinson, you know, like, I mean, that was such a, you know, like well thought out, you know, strategically, you know, executed, you know, integration plan, and not at all for Watt.
Well, and he was, I guess, yeah, like you say, he was so popular in the NCAA and NIT and these college games. They're thinking, wow, people love him. This is great. That's great until you get out of town. So that makes quite a bit of sense to me. One of the things that I found really fascinating when I got to see the play earlier this year was how much Japanese culture is in the play. And the fact that you have, you know, 3 Japanese men making this story, bringing it to life. Talk to us a little bit about that, and how did that impact your own experience as a Japanese American man, getting to dive deep into this culture and to share it?
I got to speak a little Japanese in the show. I was scared of it at first. Aaron helped me with a few of the pronunciations in some parts. Near the beginning, I say a little bit of Japanese, and I also use wood blocks through most of the folktale segments.
And that's like a Japanese thing.
Yeah.
And then you have this other thing that's kind of like a slide. In fact, let's just show it. We have a clip from the show from the play earlier this year.
Yeah,
so let's take a look.
Let's see this.
But every now and then of nights, when lightning tethered sky to earth and thunder filled the space in between, the villagers wished him well, but not all. Great deeds cast long shadows, but the knot was strong, and lightning could not pass. Thinking quickly, Tatsuyo tied a second knot behind the lightning, trapping it in place. It was a no man's land for me, all of Japan, but especially Hiroshima. The Japanese, they saw the uniform and hated it, and me in it. But I had to wear it to remind the Americans they could trust me. Everywhere I turned, I felt like a traitor in someone's eyes. I don't remember thinking about fallout or radiation until much later. My wife and I, it took us 12 years to have kids. We had them eventually, but sometimes you wonder, Some things you'll never know. Staff Sergeant Wataru Masako, June 17, 1945.
Great work, Brian.
Yeah,
It
man.
looks like it was a fun thing. A one-man show is a tough thing to do. You know, a lot of lines to memorize, a lot of stuff.
It was challenging, and I think I definitely under anticipated the work that was going to go into it. I mean, I knew it was going to be a lot of work in my mind, but when we actually got to rehearsals, it hit me so hard, and I'll just admit I was struggling a lot through a lot of the rehearsal process until I became comfortable enough in the show to carry the show. So it got easier as I go.
I see something there. Do you, as becoming a successful actor, doing a show like this is very difficult. What Watt went through in basketball was clearly very difficult. How did that impact you? Did you see a similarity? Did it sort of change a little bit of your perspective as a Japanese American man, what it takes to succeed?
Yes, and I mean, and just also recognizing his accomplishments, how much he accomplished in his life, and then just relating that into my own life, how it motivated me to be a better performer and just better in everything that I do, actually. Yeah. And I mean, we both went to the University of Utah. Obviously, I didn't study engineering. I studied theater and acting. Yeah. But I really hope everyone who saw the show, walked away with his legacy in mind.
I think that's an important point that you make, because what is his legacy here in Utah? Like I said, this is some of the first things that I've heard about his story. So are there any sort of historical places or things that are based on him here in Utah? Can you talk about that, Aaron?
Oh yeah, well I mean, the basketball court in Liberty Park in Ogden got recently renamed after him. They called it Kilowatt Court, which is something we mentioned in the show. There are, especially in Ogden, there are historical markers. There's a monument. I think there was an artist who did a project with sort of like different horses that were, painted or decorated in different ways to represent, Ogden history. And there's one in front of the sushi restaurant that occupies the space where the barbershop used to be.
Wow.
But definitely more in Ogden. I don't believe I've seen anything here in Salt Lake, but I'd be happy to eat my words if I'm wrong.
That'll probably grow over time. Now that this play was performed, and I understand from Jerry, some members of his family are being talked to about potentially there may be a movie or something coming out about it. So I mean, I don't know what's going on, but I do know that people are starting to be aware of it. Even the NBA has made acknowledgments of it, and I think the Knicks retired his jersey or something like that.
Yeah, I don't think they could retire his. I think his number had been reassigned. So they can. But they did bring him in for his was it like his 85th birthday or something like that, and gave him an honorary jersey and recognized him during a game.
Oh, that's cool.
And the University of Utah retired his jersey. It's one of the few that
that's right. University of Utah retired his jersey.
Absolutely.
Brian, when you talk about his accomplishments, I mean, obviously he was in the military. Obviously he was, the titles of the NCAA, the NBA. What other accomplishments did he have in his life? I hear that he was a public speaker. Can you speak on that?
Yeah, he was always speaking at so we have this thing called the Japanese American Citizens League. He would speak sometimes at conferences for those. He did one at the Grand America years back, and he was kind of a motivational speaker, I guess you could say, in some parts of Utah, and he was always busy. I think, and I mean, being a basketball player, which I couldn't imagine the performance anxiety of that. I mean, he was good. He was so good and when he played, it would have been something to see for sure.
Yeah.
I'm really curious about this military service, because that actually feels like as much or more a part of the story of his life as the basketball was. So what were some of the significant moments or experiences that we can glean from what he did in the military? You talked about this survey, and it's very powerful in the play when you talk about that. Can one of you share a little bit about what he did and what that experience was like for him?
So, I mean, like Brian's grandfather, your grandfather, correct? He was trained as an intelligence officer.
Military intelligence.
So Watt was originally trained for military intelligence, for some translator duties. He was also initially being prepped for, a planned invasion of Japan, which of course never happened because of the, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So instead, when he was deployed, after he'd been there for a little bit, he was assigned to this project called the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. And one part of that was a survey that was to be administered by Japanese speakers to Japanese nationals. And it was to study the effects of strategic bombing on civilian morale. So he's asking, I mean, basically, the people that he's asking are the people who are in Hiroshima, who are still in some kind of condition to get around, to get themselves to an interview, because anybody who'd really suffered the major impacts of the bombing had been evacuated to other cities that still had hospitals. And so he's this 21-year-old kid, with minimal training, conversational Japanese that had been kind of, bolstered through some training, beforehand, but sitting across the table from, Japanese nationals, asking these very clinical, sociological, survey questions of them about the effectiveness of the bomb, and it's, I mean, basically it's how well did our bomb work? Did it work the way we wanted to,
Give us an example. What?
That's terrible.
Yeah. I mean, I could
How well
not
did the bomb
imagine.
work? How many people
What
did
does
it
that do to the psyche of a 21-year-old?
Right. I mean, some of the questions were
Some of the questions, just
tell us
so I couldn't imagine. I mean, when he was asking the questions to some of the interview subjects, he was obviously ordered to not sympathize or, with them. They were ordered to not sympathize with them, but to put them at ease if they seemed nervous, and some of the questions were just like, how are things going with you now? Are you better or worse off now than you were during the war? What did you think about the atomic bomb? Which was, when you look at that question now, it's just of course it was awful, and but I mean, for Watt, and I think I mentioned it in the play, he says if I write things down by hand, they could see that I'm listening, even though I can't sympathize with them or console with them.
Yeah, you mentioned other people were using a typewriter.
Because it's faster. But I think he wanted to do it by hand to show him that he was. Then I'm sure he did sympathize with them deep down, just to show them that, even though he was ordered not to.
Well, and to be surrounded for the first time, he grew up in Ogden, Utah. It's the first time he was surrounded by people who looked like him.
I mean, granted, there was a big, Japanese-American population in Ogden, but they did very much consider themselves Americans.
I have a question. Is this a historic play? Is this the first time in Utah that you've had a Japanese director, Japanese playwright, Japanese actor? Do you guys know if this might be a first here?
There was another one I did at Plan B back in 2009. It was called Block 8.
Okay.
It was written by Matthew Ivan Bennett. Jerry also directed it. It was actually my first professional show out of college. Yeah. It was a two-person show.
But Matthew Ivan Bennett is white, though.
Yes.
So this might be the first time that this is
all Japanese.
Yeah, that's true.
Japanese.
That's true. Yeah. It was about a Japanese character who was interned with his family. But yeah, I think this is the first.
Yeah. So as a playwright, you is this something that you normally do? Because you said you're an actor, you had a few hats at the very beginning. As a playwright, you're approached by Jerry Rapier to write this play. Tell us about that process. Tell us about what it was that stood out about it that made you say, I'm taking this on. I think this is something that I can do, and I think this is going to be an easy, or maybe not an easy project to go through.
Well, that's the thing, is that actually, I had both thoughts. I first had the easy thought, and then I revised that to the more realistic thought. No, I mean, Jerry approached me, and obviously the story is incredibly exciting, and so you have that energy, and you have that excitement and that momentum, and you hit the ground running. And I started doing research, and then really started to get a sense of the scope of the project. And so, so there was that aspect, just the daunting amount of research, but then also, and I think, I'm sure Brian,
how long is the play, by the way?
The play itself is 45, 50 minutes, total. So, so that was another aspect of things, you're sort of trying to cram, not necessarily, you're trying to figure out what you can include, in that much time to, to try and tell a story that accomplishes, what you hope it accomplishes. So there's that. And then ultimately, the sort of like sense of responsibility to the people who really have a stake in this story, to surviving family members, to people, who care very much about it or were invested, in the story, inspired by, to thoughtfully sort of like honor, the story. So like that really started to that was when I really knew I was kind of in for it, was when that sense of responsibility really sunk in.
So Brian, since you're the actor in the play, you go through and you've done some performance, you've finished the run of the play. Tell me about, walk us through, for the people that haven't seen it, tell us about the whole beginning to the end, somewhat, of what this story is about.
So the story is about, my character's name is Ken Kushida, and he's a podcaster. He's like a work from home podcaster, and he's, I think, and step by step, he's trying to understand, Watt's life. He's trying to understand just everything that he went through, even though he's not a basketball guy. So he's just going through this big process of just understanding the beginning, the middle, and an end, as he's, talking to all of his podcast, listeners, as well as talking to his, grandmother on voicemail on late nights, just to, try and, he tries to get some information from her, but he never really gets to talk to her because he's always talking to her on voicemail, obviously. And I think like I said, he's just going through this huge process, voyage of discovery, of self-discovery on who this man was, and that he doesn't get forgotten, or he doesn't get forgotten from history.
So he's trying to bring his story to life, and we saw some beautiful visuals, the artistic style, monochromatic. In the play, it sort of seems to bounce back and forth with what seemed like Japanese prose or something like that.
Folk tales.
Folk tales?
Japanese folk tales, yeah, basically. So the way, and that's actually how the show begins, is with a folk tale, how starting with his parents, Fusaichi and Tatsuya Masaka, they pray for a child of their own, and then their firstborn son, they bring their firstborn son into the world, who's Wataru, and then the folktales continue through, and then also leading up to the point where the night he was born, when they're traveling through wind and snow and lightning and thunder and
Yeah,
It's not real folk tales.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, this
folk
is
tales,
his,
yeah.
his life story told in a folk
That's
tale
like his
style.
life story
But
told in a folk tale, exactly.
is that a
yeah.
Japanese cultural thing, or was it just like a style choice?
Well, I mean, for sure. So in the footage there, you saw the little stage there. That there's a theater or a storytelling style in Japan called kamishibai, which literally means paper theater. Mm-hmm. And so you've got you've got basically, you've got usually somebody riding around on a bicycle with one of these little stages on the back of their bike, and they're candy sellers basically. But they have a series of stories that are all told with these successive cards, and so those are the visuals for the story they're telling. They're usually Japanese folk tales or legends, and then they always ended in a cliffhanger, so you had to come back and buy more candy. But that seemed like a good format, especially considering that this needed to travel to different schools for educational purposes. That if we can't have the projections in the classrooms, what's a way that we could, bring that storytelling style in? And then it was also a way to kind of get at the question of where do legends end and stories begin, especially when we're talking about historical figures or sports heroes, that you can get dangerously close to folklore sometimes when enough time's passed.
So that's why you chose to use to create the podcaster to kind of bring to kind of put that all together.
Yeah, we've got 3 different ways of kind of telling the story that kind of eventually come together.
Yeah,
well, I have a question for you. So, Kilowatt was, basically at the height of his life and his career in the 1940s for Japanese Americans here in Utah. How much do you think that life has changed from the 1940s for Japanese Americans in Utah at that time that has for today? When you look at today and you think, what's really changed and what really hasn't changed?
It's roots, race, and culture. Say it like it is. Tell us how you really feel.
Let me think on that. I'd say it's for the Japanese community, the small Japanese community here in Utah, it's changed quite a bit. I mean, it's obviously different from, you know, since World War II and since the internment. I mean, it's a part of history, I think, that no one really talks about as well. Most Japanese, you know, are aware of it, especially the ones who are Watt's generation, who don't like to talk about it. And most of, you know, my generation, the Onsei, you know, generation, I mean, most of us have an understanding of it. I mean, I don't think we fully understand the struggles and the hardships, you know, that generation went through. But to me, and me being a native Utahn, I mean, I think most of us, we just always feel, even though a lot of us were born and raised here in Utah, we always feel like the minority. I mean, we're always
feel
the Asian
more
face
Japanese
in the general population. I mean, and that's not a bad thing in any ways. It's just, you know, how people see us. We're not white. So,
There's kind of and maybe this does factor in, you know, I mean, I'll go with maybe that this does factor into, you know, some of why, you know, like Watt's story sort of like slips through the cracks historically, is that there is a certain invisibility that kind of comes with the sort of model minority status of, you know, Japanese, where you're sort of like othered, but also not necessarily considered disadvantaged, you know, and so yeah, as a result, you know, like you can feel sort of invisible in a way because, people sort of assume that you don't need things that you might need, or that you're going to conform to certain stereotypes that sort of, you know, mean that you're going to be, you know, like contributing to society in this way, or that you're going to, you know, that you're not going to need sort of the same visibility and support that maybe other, you know, people from, you know, minority populations might.
And you used a term there.
Yeah.
That I would love for you. No, I just want you to expand upon that term so our audience understands that a little bit more. Expand upon the term model minority.
Ooh.
And also, you mentioned the generation. There's a name for, depending on how many generations there are between you and Japan and your family. Like there's a term for that you guys talk about. But go
yes,
ahead.
Please expand upon that for our audience.
First, the model minority.
Okay, and you know, like bear in mind, I'm like by no means like an expert on this, but my understanding of it, which really deepened, you know, as I was doing the research on this, you know, it actually, a lot of it started like right after this idea of like model minorities started, you know, in a big way for Japanese populations right after World War II, where you saw so many, you know, Japanese families, you know, coming out of incarceration and finding, you know, sort of like finding their way back to great success, you know, through, and so, you know, the Japanese population was often held up, you know, like in like newspaper editorials and in, you know, like public opinion pieces as, you know, sort of like an exemplar of like what could be accomplished, you know, but through like hard work and so on and so forth, which, you know, sounds like kind of a great thing, except that, you know, it also really, you know, like fundamentally oversimplifies, you know, like it leaves out, you know, like all the factors that kind of like went into, you know, making that happen, you know, like how much was required to, you know, to like find their way back to that after everything had been taken from them.
Yeah, it feels like you're saying like the idea is like, in spite of being imprisoned for X number of months or whatever, they still came out fighting and got their educations and were successful.
Right, like leaving out the fact that, like, despite the fact that we stole everything, you know, that they had.
Yeah,
you know,
their property? Where would their property go?
Yeah, but then I mean, one of the most frustrating things about it too is that that's then used as sort of like a cudgel or like as a standard, you know, or a way to sort of like, you know, continue to oversimplify, you know, situations where you have sort of like unsupported minority populations who, you know, like who are, you know, being either, you know, like disregarded or, you know, held in like a lower opinion traditionally, because people can always point to this model population and say like, why can't you be like them, instead of, but not really unpacking like what be like them means, you know, and like how it was that they were able to be that
But
way.
then it kind of buries you, right? Because right, Brian? Because I mean, that's. I mean, I would guess you have an opinion on the model minority thing, and do you think that may have contributed to the fact as to why the Kilowatt is not as known, is because they just say, well, he's just kind of part of, you know, almost like white history? Or what are your opinions on that?
I mean, as far as model minority, I think there's like this, maybe, I don't know, maybe a lot of people think that, you know, Japanese are supposed to be, they're supposed to be, you know, they're supposed to be this way, they're supposed to be this smart at doing these kinds of things. Like, that's I mean, I'm talking stereotyping doctors or scientists and something like that, which I think a lot of people viewed in me, or when people first meet me, they that's what they assume a lot of times.
Then you tell them
That's
you're
a
an actor, and they're like,
stereotype.
what?
You see, I go to school for theater, and they're like, what?
Yeah. So I mean, I don't know. It's just one of those things, I think, as far as like model stereotype and how with the show. I mean, the show had a great turnaround, and you know, I'm glad, you know, so many people supported it through Utah Presents and through Plan B. I think that was
Utah Presents, that was like a co-production?
Yes, yeah,
Yeah,
Kilowatt
yeah.
was a co-production between Utah Presents at Kingsbury Hall and
Plan B. Yeah.
Cool.
So yeah, I'm glad even the people who saw it that weren't Japanese, I really hope they took something away from it, something very meaningful and deep.
I'm sure they did. And in fact, I want to hear from you guys, from Watt's story, from his experience. Is there anything that we can learn about perseverance and identity, especially when it relates to things like barriers in sports or dealing with like very strong political barriers and separations between us and polarization? Can we learn anything about how to handle these situations in our current climate or in our own personal lives from what Watt went through? Because he was successful even after the NBA experience.
What about you, Aaron? What are your thoughts on that? You're on the spot, my friend. Let's hear it.
What's the lesson to learn? What's the moral of the story?
Or even any final thoughts that you have about, you know, your experience with this, the play, the just what we should get from Kilowatt's life.
I mean, you know, frankly, like the two biggest things. Well, I mean, yeah, if I can be so audacious as to have like two. I mean, one major thing is that, you know, connection and community are those will be the things that that save us, sort of like determine, you know, what the path is going to look like forward. You know, there were so many ways, and you know, like Watt referred to himself as a really lucky guy. And when you look at the events of his life, you know, it's hard. It can be hard not to disagree. You know, it can be hard to disagree, because so many things went right, you know, in order for him to get to where he got. But then from another standpoint, you know, you think about that, you have to kind of think about that as like, look how many things had to go right to level the playing field enough so that someone of like obvious, you know, extraordinary skill, you know, could be given, you know, the opportunity, you know, same opportunities as other people. And that all those opportunities came from connections with other people in his community, inside the Japanese American community, and you know, his school community, in the athletic community, that really was, you know, like it really did, you know, like take a village to you know, to get him to where he got. And he, you know, and I think that was part of why he, you know, also downplayed his accomplishments, because he realized how much they, you know, depended on the support of other people. And that when we look at somebody, you know, who has a story that seems simple, that seems legendary, or that seems tragic, you know, that there are deeper stories in there, specific stories about human connection, and that those moments of connection are going to be what shape our stories going forward.
Nice.
Well, that's beautiful.
Brian, what are your final thoughts?
And then just as Aaron said, I mean, that's one of the meanings. I mean, his name has multiple meanings, but one that struck me was to connect, basically. That's the name of that was the meaning of his name, was to connect. And the way he connected with, you know, with everything, with his family, with his teammates, his friends, and how he touched the community and the Japanese community in that way to this day. And I think that's a big thing. That was a big thing for me in the play as well. I love the final part where, you know, I have the play where I get to, you know, talk about kanji, how it conveys ideas and sounds, and what his name means. It really hits you right there.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
connection is wonderful, you know, and I think that's what community is all about. And I think this is a great story that people need to know about. I think it's a great story that has been told. Wonderful job on both of your parts, on the part of Plan B Theater, and we thank you so much for being a part of our show today, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for connecting us with him and with history. From all of us at PBS Utah, we want to thank you for joining this conversation. As always, other episodes can be found on our website, pbsutah.org/roots, or on the PBS Utah YouTube channel.
And if you have feedback or ideas for other episodes, be sure to give us a shout out on social media. Until next time, for Roots, Race, and Culture, y'all, we are out.
Funding for Roots, Race, and Culture is provided in part by the Norman C. and Barbara L. Tanner Charitable Support Trust and by donations to PBS Utah from viewers like you. Thank you.